In the coastal city of Utica, in the spring of 46 BC, a lamp burned late in a modest room while the harbor below filled with refugees and rumor. Word had come that day. The army of the Roman Republic was broken, its last field commanders scattered or dead, and the victorious General Julius Caesar was marching toward the city with his legions. Inside that room sat a man named Cato, 50 years old, gaunt from campaign life, known across Rome for a single, uncompromising trait. He could not be bought, flattered, or frightened into changing his mind. Outside his door, soldiers and senators waited anxiously for his orders, because in the chaos of defeat, he alone had kept his composure. But Cato was not thinking about the battle that had already been lost. He was thinking about a choice that remained entirely his own, one that no army, no general, and no empire could make for him. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what Rome had become. For decades, the Republic had been a fragile balance of senators, laws, and shared power, imperfect, quarrelsome, but free in the sense that no single man was above it. Cato had spent his entire adult life defending that balance, often standing alone in the Senate to oppose corruption, bribery, and the growing ambitions of powerful men. He was famous for walking to the Senate House on foot while others rode in litters, for refusing gifts that other officials took as a matter of course, for arguing unpopular positions simply because he believed them true. His enemies mocked his rigidity. His admirers called him the last honest man in Rome. Both were describing the same quality, an almost inhuman consistency between what he believed and how he lived. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome itself, breaking the old rules by force, Cato understood immediately what was at stake. Not just a war between armies, but the end of a certain kind of freedom. The civil war that followed devastated the Roman world. Cato allied himself with the Republican cause, marching his soldiers across brutal desert terrain in North Africa rather than abandon the men who depended on him. He refused the honor of supreme command, insisting that others with more military experience should lead instead. Another small, telling act of a man who valued principle over personal glory. But principle could not stop Caesar's legions. At the Battle of Thapsus, the Republican forces were crushed. Thousands died. The survivors fled toward the coastal city of Utica, where Cato had remained behind, organizing supplies, tending to the wounded, and preparing ships to evacuate anyone who wished to escape. He was, by every account, calmer than the men around him, walking the docks at night, checking manifests, reassuring frightened senators and soldiers that they would find passage to safety. He did this work meticulously, right up until the last ship had sailed. Only then did he turn his attention to himself. Caesar, meanwhile, was already composing his next move, and it was not the move his enemies expected. Rather than promising to execute the surviving Republican leaders, Caesar had built his political brand on a policy of clemency. He pardoned former enemies publicly, restored their property, invited them to dine at his table. It was, in its way, a brilliant strategy. Mercy made him look generous, secured loyalty, and quietly erased the idea that anyone had truly defeated him. Because a man who forgives you has, in the eyes of history, already placed himself above you. Word reached Utica that Caesar intended to pardon Cato as well, perhaps even to elevate him publicly as proof of his own magnanimity. For most defeated men, this would have sounded like salvation. For Cato, it sounded like something else entirely, a subtler kind of defeat, one aimed not at his body but at his name, his legacy, the very meaning of everything he had spent his life defending. To accept Caesar's pardon would mean admitting that Caesar had the right to forgive him, that the Republic's cause had been merely a rebellion, now graciously excused by its conqueror. Cato refused to let his life become part of that story. This was not stubborn pride, though many at the time read it that way. It was, in his mind, the last political act available to him, to die as a free citizen of a republic that no longer existed, rather than live as a pardoned subject of a man who had made himself master of Rome. On his final evening, he gathered his son and a small circle of friends for dinner. The conversation, as his biographers later recorded, turned philosophical, specifically to a famous Stoic paradox, that only the wise man is truly free, because freedom is not the absence of chains but the absence of internal compulsion. Everyone at the table understood, though no one said it aloud, that Cato was not simply discussing philosophy. He was explaining himself. After the meal, Cato withdrew to his room and asked for a particular book, Plato's Dialogue on the Immortality of the Soul, written centuries earlier as an account of Socrates' final hours before his own execution. He read it once, calmly. Then, strangely, he read it again from the beginning. Those outside the door later said his voice when he spoke to his servant sounded lighter than it had in weeks, not despairing, but resolved, almost peaceful. He was not a man working himself into a frenzy of grief. He was a man closing a long argument he had been having with himself, quietly, for years, whether life was worth preserving at any cost, or whether some things, integrity, consistency, the refusal to be owned by another man's mercy, mattered more than survival itself. Somewhere in that second reading of Socrates' final words, Cato appears to have reached his answer, and having reached it, he set the book down without hesitation. Then came the disruption no one expected. Cato asked for his sword. It was not brought. His son and household servants, sensing exactly what he intended, had quietly removed it from his room hours earlier, hoping that without a weapon, the night would simply pass and morning would bring some other resolution. When Cato realized what had happened, his composure broke for the first and only time that night. He did not shout in despair. He demanded, with cold fury, to know by what right anyone believed they could decide the terms of his own life on his behalf. He reportedly struck the servant who admitted to hiding the weapon, not out of cruelty, but out of a sudden, raw insistence that this decision belonged to him and to no one else, not his son, not his friends, not Caesar, not even people who loved him and were trying, in their own frightened way, to save him. It is worth pausing on this moment, because it reveals something easy to miss in the story of Cato's death. This was not a man collapsing under despair, indifferent to his own life. He was, in fact, fighting fiercely for control over it, not control over whether he would live or die, but control over the meaning of his death and the manner in which he faced it. He calmed himself enough to reason with his son, explaining, according to later accounts, that a man who had spent his entire life governing himself according to reason could not now be treated like a child or a madman, stripped of the one choice that remained entirely his to make. Eventually, worn down and unable to argue further, his household returned the sword to him. Cato thanked him quietly, set it beside his bed, and, remarkably, slept for several hours, as calmly, witnesses said, as any night before it. Years passed on. Gero's and Musonius' reputation as the philosopher who refused to be broken slowly reached back to the Roman mainland, whispered among those who still respected wisdom over fear. Then, in 68 AD, Nero's reign collapsed entirely. Facing rebellion, betrayal by his own guards, and abandonment by the Senate, the emperor took his own life rather than face capture. Rome entered a period of chaos, with 4 emperors rising and falling within a single tumultuous year. Amid this upheaval, many of Nero's exiled victims were eventually recalled, their sentences reversed by new leadership eager to distance itself from his cruelty. Musonius Rufus was among those permitted to return. He walked back into Roman society not as a broken, forgotten prisoner, but as a figure whose reputation had, if anything, grown stronger during his absence. The very punishment intended to erase him from public life had instead demonstrated, in the most public way possible, the core claim of his teaching, that character forged through discipline cannot be undone by circumstance, no matter how severe. Back in Rome, Musonius resumed teaching and his influence only deepened. Among his students during this later period was a young, physically disabled former slave named Epictetus, a man who would go on to become one of the most important Stoic voices in history, later teaching his own students, including a future Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius. Through this unbroken chain, the philosophy Musonius refined on a barren island, self-discipline unaffected by circumstance, virtue accessible to anyone regardless of status, would eventually shape the private journal of the most powerful man in the empire. It's worth pausing on this detail. The ideas that would later guide an emperor governing the known world were first tested and hardened not in luxury, but through exile, shipwreck, and thirst on a forgotten rock. Musonius himself would face exile again under a later emperor, Vespasian, who banished most philosophers from Rome yet reportedly made a personal exception for him, a rare acknowledgement of just how seriously his integrity had come to be respected, even by those in power who generally distrusted philosophers entirely. So what exactly did Geros teach Musonius Rufus that a comfortable life in Rome never could have? It wasn't a new doctrine or clever argument. It was confirmation, tested in the harshest possible conditions, of something he had always suspected but never been forced to prove, that a person's inner freedom does not depend on their outer circumstances. Rome could seize his property, strip his titles, and abandon him on a waterless rock, but it could not touch his capacity to think clearly, treat others with dignity, or find purpose in even the smallest daily tasks. This is the essential Stoic insight often misunderstood as cold detachment, when in reality it's the opposite, a fierce, practical commitment to remaining useful and humane precisely when circumstances give you every excuse not to be. Musonius didn't wait for rescue, restoration, or vindication before choosing to live meaningfully again. He began doing it immediately, on the very shore where his ship had broken apart, because he understood something most people only discover in crisis, that the classroom of character is wherever you happen to be standing. It's tempting to hear this story and file it away as an inspiring tale from a distant, dramatic past. Shipwrecks and emperors feel far removed from ordinary modern struggles. But strip away the Roman politics and ancient geography, and the core situation is startlingly familiar. Nearly everyone, at some point, finds themselves stranded on some version of Jaros, a job that feels like a dead end, a diagnosis that limits what once seemed possible, a relationship or city or circumstance they didn't choose and can't easily escape. The instinctive response is almost always the same one. Musonius refused: waiting. Waiting for rescue, waiting for circumstances to improve, waiting for permission to start living fully again. Musonius's radical move wasn't complicated philosophy, it was simply refusing to postpone meaning until his external situation changed. He built structure, purpose, and even generosity toward others while still standing on the rock that was supposed to destroy him. That refusal to wait is available to anyone in any circumstance, starting immediately, not once things get easier, but especially while they haven't. There's a specific detail from this story worth carrying with you. Musonius didn't teach grand theory on Jaros. He taught people how to find water, how to manage anger, how to work with their hands without resentment, how to speak calmly to someone panicking. Small, unglamorous, immediate actions. That is the real lesson hiding inside this dramatic history. Philosophy that only works in ideal conditions was never philosophy worth having in the first place. If your character, patience, or discipline only function when life is convenient, they aren't actually yours yet. They're borrowed from good circumstances that could disappear at any moment, exactly as Musonius's comfortable life in Rome once did overnight. The measure of any principle you claim to hold is not how it performs in comfort, but whether it survives contact with your own personal version of a store-wrecked ship in a waterless island. Musonius passed that test not because he was naturally fearless, but because he had spent years deliberately practicing small disciplines long before the crisis arrived, so that when it did, the response was already second nature rather than something he had to invent under pressure. So here is one concrete thing to take from Musonius Rufus today, not as abstract inspiration, but as an actual practice. Identify one area of your life you've been treating as a waiting room, something you've decided doesn't count yet, doesn't deserve your full effort, because conditions aren't right. Maybe it's a career you consider temporary, a body you're waiting to feel proud of before caring for it properly, or a relationship you're holding at arm's length until circumstances improve. Then do exactly what Musonius did on that barren shoreline. Begin practicing the actual behavior you want to embody today, inside the imperfect situation exactly as it currently exists. Not once you're rescued, not once the metaphorical ship stops sinking. Speak with the patience you claim to value in the middle of the annoying meeting. Practice the discipline you promise yourself for tomorrow, in the small unglamorous task sitting in front of you right now. Jaros was never really about geography. It was about refusing to let a difficult place decide, on your behalf, whether your life had already stopped counting.